In the film The Elephant Man, Joseph's journey by steamer and train back to England from Belgium is covered by but a few minutes of screen time. However, his, I would say, courageous and heroic effort to make such a journey was much more complicated than the film suggests, while the scene where Joseph arrives at Liverpool Street Station is almost as it happened. It is not certain exactly when it was decided that Joseph should go to the continent. It was virtually impossible now for Joseph's managers to continue to have Joseph exhibit himself anymore. Such shows were gradually being outlawed, and there was constant harassment from the authorities, quite apart from the novelty value of Joseph as a singular attraction, however harsh that sounds, starting to wear thin. Perhaps Sam Torr and Sam Roper felt that it might even be best for Joseph to go on to pastures new, as it were, even as I'm sure they were sad to see him go and didn't want to lose him. There is much confusion and conjecture about who exactly it was, but the belief is it may have been an Italian, possibly called Ferrari, who took over Joseph's interests, taking him onto the continent with him while he was working at that time with Sam Roper. However, the hope that Joseph would escape from such harassment from the authorities, even abroad, was short-lived. The police would soon arrive at their show almost as soon as it opened and move them on, especially in the light of Joseph's terrible deformity. And it did not take Joseph's new manager long to realise that he had taken on what was a huge liability. Poor Joseph. He was, it seems, to be on the receiving end of his new and unscrupulous manager's anger and resentment at the situation he found himself in, burdened with a performer he could not show, as, in an act of certain revenge, and probably thinking he would take what was due to him at taking such a risk with Joseph in the first place, one morning Joseph woke up to find himself robbed of his savings. Of course, Joseph still clung on to his dream of saving up to buy a little house, and by this time he had saved up £50, which was a considerable sum. To be robbed of this money, his dream, was terrible enough, but even worse, he was to find himself completely abandoned without a friend in a foreign country, without the means to communicate. A most frightening predicament indeed. Joseph must have been absolutely terrified and traumatised by the turn of events. However, resourceful as he always tried to be, he already started to consider how he might get back to England. Indeed, he had no choice. Somehow, Joseph pawned most of his possessions, just enough to pay for the fare to get him back to England. Yet while he was desperate to reach England's safe and familiar shores, he could see in truth nothing beyond that would be his final destination, which was to be the train terminal at Liverpool Street Station. It seems to be that Joseph decided first to make his way to Ostend, with the intention of catching the packet service to Dover and then on by train to hopefully arrive at Victoria Station. Now began for him the most harrying journey of his life, as he took the train first from Brussels. It is easy to imagine his terrified form, pressed into the farthest seat he could find, wrapping himself protectively in his cloak and trying to avoid other passengers, while at the same time being stared at on the train itself or through the window even before the train's departure, and then being followed, just as it had always been, wherever he went when he finally reached Ostend. But things were going to get even worse for poor Joseph, as, and regarding this, it is totally unimaginable how he must have felt, he was refused passage by the cross-channel ferry captain. What was he to do? But, wonderfully, Joseph had a piece of well-deserved good fortune, as he was to be helped out by Mr. Wardle Cardew, who it seems to have had some medical connections, and gave Joseph the shelter and help he was in desperate need of at that moment. At his advice, perhaps, a guardian angel indeed, Joseph made his way instead back along the coast by train to Antwerp. From there was also a packet service back to Harwich. Joseph must have used up the last of his money to pay the second-class fare back to London, which was all of 15 shillings. This time he got aboard the packet ship, the SS Norwich, without incident, and the journey across the Channel would have taken the whole of the night. It can be imagined how it must have been for Joseph during that journey, just as in the film, trying desperately to hide himself out of sight as much as it was possible, perhaps out on deck and keeping himself as much as he could sheltered from the elements. The train docked at Harwich at about 4 in the morning, and Joseph shuffled wearily after a journey which had actually taken several days, and towards the waiting train. As before and as ever, he tried to find a place far from the other passengers and in isolation, and finally the train pulled away at 5 a.m, and Joseph was to begin the final leg of his terrible adventure, not knowing what was to await him or what he was to do once he reached journey's end, but probably just relieved in those few brief hours of a certain respite that he was back on England's soil. At 10 to 7 in the morning, on the 24th of June 1886, the train finally pulled into Liverpool Street Station. A dazed, exhausted and ill Joseph got himself up from his seat and opened the carriage door, to step out onto the platform with difficulty, and to be met by the familiar sounds and smells of his homeland. Perhaps it was only now the full enormity of what had happened to him, and the terror of not knowing what he was to do next. He had nowhere to go, no friend or family who could call on for help, dawned on him. During the journey, perhaps his sheer desperation to get back to England at any cost had blocked out his uncertainty to some extent, but now as he made his way up the platform towards the ticket collector, he must have been absolutely bemused and more terrified than he had ever been before in his entire life. To compound this horrendous and alarming situation, this sudden and remarkable and top-heavy figure attired in the cloak and the pillar-box hat with its grey flannel veil drew at once the attention of the commuters and other passengers that packed the already busy station. Whatever he did, moved, stood still, any gestures he made, his garbled speech, as I imagine he may have tried to communicate, caused people to turn and stare, point and speculate, and then follow him, wherever and whenever he tried to walk. He must have been poignantly reminded of those times he had hawked in Leicester, and suffered similarly as he tried to sell his tray of goods, while a trail of children, even adults, would shadow his every move. His terror of the situation in which he now found himself was beyond the pale, and it was fortunate that before things got out of hand, I can imagine that there might have been those of the more curious and downright cruel who might have tried to disrobe him of his cloak or to take the hat away. 2 constables arrived, just in time to save the situation. Guarding Joseph from the pressing crowds, they led him to a 3rd-class waiting room, where he simply collapsed in a heap on the floor with exhaustion, and apparently giving himself up to fate. The constables tried to understand him, but his speech was unintelligible. His voice may have been expressed in a kind of nervous excitement borne by his anxiety too, which would have made it even worse. However, Joseph had something on his person which he had kept safe all this while, all through these troubles. It was Treves' business card, which he had been given perhaps during one of his visits to the medical college, when he had been examined in front of Treves' eminent colleagues. Joseph had, after a few instances of these lectures, refused to attend any more, feeling he was in a cattle market, to use Joseph's own words, much to Treves' most certain annoyance and frustration. Therefore, to my mind, it is mysterious and odd that Joseph kept the card and was to surrender it up to the constables with his delicate left hand, in effect calling upon a man who he may have actually resented the last time he saw him, to be, hopefully, his saviour. It was, whatever was going through Joseph's bemused mind at that point, clearly a last and desperate unspoken cry for help. Treves did indeed come to his rescue, the London hospital not being so far away as well, and he claimed Joseph. At his own volition, he took responsibility for this gentle yet ever brave and determined man, without a second thought to call a cab and take Joseph back to the hospital. The hospital which would eventually be Joseph's home for the rest of his life, and where he would enjoy some wonderful moments of happiness at last. Thank you for listening.